The house in Brentwood was supposed to be a place where time slowed down, where Christmas lights softened the edges of every hard year. Instead, it became the kind of headline that makes an entire city feel suddenly older. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were gone, and Hollywood so practiced at pretending couldn't find a script for the quiet that followed. In a neighborhood built for privacy, privacy turned into a sealed door, and grief arrived not as tears, but as a heavy, stunned stillness that clung to everything. Somewhere in that stillness, another name kept surfacing like a shadow you can't step away from: Nick Reiner. Not a tabloid character, not a punchline, but the grandson of Carl Reiner, of the man who taught America to laugh, who built careers out of timing and warmth and the belief that humor could keep darkness at arm's length. 3 generations, 1 family, and a silence that had been passed down so gently no one noticed it hardening. Tonight is not a biography. It's the moment a legacy stops sounding like applause and starts sounding like footsteps in a hallway you don't want to walk alone. Shock does not announce itself with drama. It arrives as a failure of the body to cooperate. In the hours after the news spread, Rob Reiner's world narrowed to small, unmanageable details. The weight of a phone that kept vibrating, the way the air in the room felt thicker than it should. The impossible calm of familiar objects. Refusing to acknowledge what had happened, he did not collapse in public. He did not cry on cue. His hands trembled when no one was watching, and his breathing slowed as if his chest were negotiating whether it was safe to keep going. Time behaved strangely. Minutes stretched, then vanished. Conversations floated past him without landing. The mind trained for decades to shape stories could not assemble a single sentence that made sense of this one. What replaced thought was a hollow vigilance, a feeling that something essential had slipped loose and might never be secured again. Fear followed grief closely, not loud or panicked, but cold and precise. Fear of what he had missed. Fear of the things he had chosen not to say. Fear that silence, once mistaken for stability, had quietly done its work. And threaded through it all was an unbearable doubling of pain, the loss itself, and the realization that loss does not arrive alone. It drags history with it. Every memory began to replay with a new emphasis, every choice suddenly demanding to be re-examined. This was not mourning as the movies portray it. It was disorientation, a private freefall where the ground refuses to appear. In that suspended state, Rob did not yet understand the shape of what had been broken. He only knew that whatever came next would not allow him to look backward without consequence. Before the tragedy hardened every memory, the Reiner family lived inside a rhythm that felt reassuring precisely because it was familiar. Dinners happened without ceremony. Conversations drifted from work to ordinary worries and back again. Laughter, inherited and practiced, functioned as a shared language, a way to smooth over what felt too heavy to name directly. Carl Reiner had built his life around that instinct. He believed humor was not avoidance, but armor, something you put on each day to move through a world that could otherwise bruise you. Rob absorbed that lesson early. He learned that presence mattered more than speeches, that showing up counted even when words failed. In quieter moments, Carl's love appeared through consistency: a phone call that came exactly when expected, a seat saved at the table, an interest in the details of his son's work that never turned into intrusion. To outsiders, it looked like harmony. To those inside, it felt like balance maintained by mutual restraint. As Rob became a husband and a father, he recreated that balance in his own home. He protected routine fiercely, believing stability itself was a form of care. Problems were handled through action rather than confession. Concerns were managed, not aired. When tension surfaced, it was softened with patience, redirected with effort, postponed with hope. Nick grew up inside that environment, surrounded by love that rarely raised its voice. He was never excluded, never dismissed, never treated as disposable. Yet he also grew up inside a family that trusted time more than confrontation, that believed endurance could outlast turmoil. Small warning signs did not announce themselves as threats. They arrived as moments, easily rationalized moods, easily excused behaviors framed as phases that would pass, if given enough room. That was the inheritance at work, an assumption that care quietly applied would eventually correct the course. For years it seemed plausible. The household continued to function. Roles stayed intact. The past felt safely behind them, and the future, while uncertain, did not feel dangerous. That sense of safety was real, but it was also provisional. It depended on the idea that love did not need to be translated to be understood. It depended on silence remaining benign. No one in that house woke up expecting disaster. They woke up trusting what had always carried them through. And that trust, built slowly over decades, would later become the most painful thing to look back on, because it explains not negligence but faith. Warning signs rarely arrive with clarity. They appear as fragments easily dismissed when viewed in isolation. In the Reiner household, concern did not erupt all at once. It accumulated quietly, like pressure building beneath a surface that still looked calm. There were conversations that ended too quickly, worries softened by reassurance, moments when unease was acknowledged only to be set aside in favor of patience. Rob believed deeply in giving space. He believed that control could damage trust, that pressing too hard might push someone further away. That belief did not come from neglect but from inheritance. Carl had raised him to respect autonomy, to let people find their footing without constant correction. Applied to ordinary challenges, that philosophy had served the family well for years. Applied to instability, it became more complicated. There were nights when sleep came late, when thoughts circled without resolution. Rob sensed danger in vague outlines rather than concrete facts. He felt fear, but feared the consequences of naming it more. Speaking fear aloud can make it feel irreversible, like crossing a line you cannot uncross. So he chose vigilance over confrontation, supervision over confession, hoping that care would be enough to hold everything in place. Others noticed things too, but concern traveled cautiously through the family, passed in lowered voices wrapped in qualifiers. No one wanted to be the person who overreacted, the one who disrupted the fragile equilibrium everyone depended on. Silence in that context felt protective. It kept the family intact. It kept conversations civil. It kept hope alive. But hope without articulation can drift into denial without anyone noticing the moment it happens. Each time a sign was postponed rather than addressed, it did not disappear. It simply moved deeper, becoming harder to reach. Rob told himself that patience was strength, that endurance would win out as it always had before. Carl, watching from the outside as age slowed him, trusted his son's judgment. He had raised Rob to be careful, to be thoughtful, to weigh consequences. He did not challenge the approach, because challenging it would have meant questioning the very values he had spent a lifetime instilling. And so the pattern held. The family continued forward, bound by love, restrained by caution, convinced that restraint itself was a form of responsibility. Looking back, none of these choices appear reckless. They appear human. They are the decisions people make when they believe the future can still be managed if everyone stays calm. What makes them haunting is not what was done, but what was deferred. Because in families shaped by quiet endurance, danger is not ignored. It is simply asked to wait. And waiting when fear is involved can become its own kind of risk. The second breaking point did not arrive as a revelation from outside, but as a moment when what had been held back could no longer remain contained. Silence, stretched thin over years, began to speak in indirect ways. Words that had once felt unnecessary suddenly felt overdue. Rob found himself revisiting conversations in his head, replaying the exact phrasing he had chosen, wondering how different outcomes might have been if tone had shifted, if hesitation had given way to clarity. This was not confession as spectacle, it was confession as exhaustion. The truth, when it finally surfaced, did not accuse anyone outright. It exposed fear. Fear of losing control, fear of pushing too hard, fear of becoming the kind of father who mistakes authority for care. Rob had believed restraint was kindness. Now restraint revealed its other edge. What had been meant to protect began to look like distance. What had been meant to preserve trust began to feel like absence. The realization was not sudden. It crept in, slowly gaining weight with each passing hour. He spoke about love, but love felt insufficient without language. He spoke about responsibility, but responsibility without confrontation began to feel incomplete. The family's shared habit of endurance, once a source of pride, now felt brittle. Carl's voice echoed in memory not as instruction, but as influence. The lessons of a lifetime resurfaced in a new light. Carl had survived by containing emotion, by choosing steadiness over expression. Rob had inherited that method without questioning whether the circumstances had changed. What worked in one era, in one life, may not survive unchanged in another. The truth that emerged was painful precisely because it did not come with villains. It came with recognition that love had been abundant but communication had lagged behind reality. Recognition that fear, when unspoken, does not disappear. It reorganizes itself. In that space, Rob confronted the most difficult admission of all, that he had trusted the past to solve problems the present demanded he name. This was not a betrayal of his father's values. It was their limit. The family had relied on patience as a solution, believing time would soften everything sharp. Instead, time sharpened what remained unresolved. Speaking now did not undo what had already happened, but it stripped away the illusion that silence had been neutral. It had shaped the outcome as surely as any action. In that moment of clarity, Rob understood that truth does not always arrive in time to change events. Sometimes it arrives only to change how those events must be carried, and carrying them would require a language he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Guilt rarely presents itself as a single emotion. It arrives layered, contradictory, impossible to resolve cleanly. For Rob Reiner, guilt did not announce a verdict. It asked questions that refused to stay quiet. What if he had spoken sooner? What if he had insisted instead of accommodating? What if the line between patience and postponement had been drawn differently? Each question circled the same painful center. Love had been present, but clarity had not. He found himself arguing with his own memories, trying to determine whether caution had been wisdom or fear wearing a responsible mask. The mind, once trained to shape narratives with beginnings and endings, now encountered a story that would not organize itself. Every path seemed to loop back to the same unresolved space where silence had once felt safer than confrontation. Anger followed guilt, not as rage directed outward, but as a sharp inward recoil. Anger at circumstance. Anger at the limits of inheritance. Anger at the realization that the values he had trusted most were not universally protective. Carl Reiner had taught endurance restraint, the belief that steady love could weather storms without constant explanation. Rob had carried those teachings faithfully, believing they represented strength. Now he faced the possibility that strength without articulation can become rigidity, and rigidity can fracture under pressure. The most punishing questions were the simplest ones. Why didn't I say it? Why did I wait? Why did I assume time would do the work words were meant to do? These questions did not seek answers, they imposed weight. They turned every memory into evidence, every decision into a cross-examination of intention versus effect. And yet blame resisted clarity. Rob could not reduce what happened to a single mistake without distorting the truth. The truth was messier. It involved fear that felt protective, love that felt constant, and silence that felt practical until it wasn't. Blaming his father felt unjust, yet ignoring inheritance felt dishonest. Blaming himself felt inevitable, yet insufficient. Responsibility scattered across decades, across habits learned long before the crisis demanded a different response. In moments of exhaustion, Rob considered the cruel paradox at the heart of it all. The very qualities that had made his family functional for so long had also limited their ability to adapt when the ground shifted beneath them. Patience became delay, trust became assumption, privacy became isolation. None of these transformations were intentional, and that was precisely the problem. They occurred quietly, without confrontation, without alarm. He replayed his father's presence in his mind not as an accusation but as a mirror. Carl had loved fiercely within the language he knew. Rob had done the same. The tragedy was not that love failed, but that it was asked to carry more weight than it could bear without translation. In the aftermath, Rob wrestled with a deeper moral question that extended beyond personal regret. How much responsibility do we bear for patterns we inherit unconsciously? At what point does understanding become obligation if you recognize a cycle late? Are you guilty for not recognizing it sooner, or human for not seeing what you were taught to normalize? These questions offered no relief, only context, and context, while clarifying, does not lighten grief. The anger ebbed and returned. The guilt shifted shape, the questions persisted. What remained constant was the recognition that silence had not been neutral. It had participated, not out of malice but out of habit. That recognition did not condemn the past, but it demanded a reckoning with it. Rob began to understand that accountability does not always mean assigning fault. Sometimes it means naming limits, naming the point where inherited wisdom stops being sufficient. Naming the cost of waiting. Naming the fear that hides inside restraint. These names did not undo what had been lost. They offered no comfort, but they did mark a boundary, a place where repetition could end even if resolution never fully arrived. In that space, Rob stood not as a man seeking absolution, but as one learning how to hold pain without disguising it. And that, for someone raised to believe endurance was enough, became its own quiet transformation. The aftermath of tragedy is not a conclusion, but a long, uneven echo. For Rob Reiner, life did not divide itself neatly into before and after. It folded inward, forcing him to live with memories that now carried different weight. Ordinary moments became unreliable. Familiar rooms felt altered, as if they were holding information he could no longer ignore. Sleep arrived unevenly, interrupted by images that refused to settle, by conversations replayed with new emphasis. This was not grief as spectacle. It was grief as persistence, a low, constant presence that reshaped perception rather than overwhelming it all at once. Over time, Rob began to recognize the signs of trauma not as weakness but as the body's attempt to process what language had failed to contain. Hypervigilance replaced ease. Silence no longer felt protective, it felt loud. The past did not accuse him outright, but it pressed close, asking to be acknowledged rather than managed. In that pressure, Rob confronted the legacy left behind. Not in terms of achievement or reputation, but in terms of emotional inheritance. Carl Reiner's influence remained undeniable, both as a source of strength and as a cautionary outline. Carl had taught endurance, dignity, and the power of restraint. Those lessons built a life of remarkable contribution, but they also revealed their limits when carried forward without revision. Legacy, Rob realized, is not a finished object. It is a process that continues shaping those who inherit it, whether they choose to examine it or not. The most lasting damage was not public but internal. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, not with others but with himself. The belief that love alone could resolve everything no longer held. Love needed language. Care needed confrontation. Silence needed to be named before it could be softened. None of these realizations offered redemption, they offered responsibility. Rob did not seek to rewrite the past or reduce it to a moral lesson. He understood now that tragedy rarely provides clean meaning. It leaves behind fragments, and the task of the living is to decide how to carry them. The psychological cost remained visible in the way certain topics tightened his chest, in the way absence made itself felt at unexpected hours. Yet within that cost existed a fragile possibility: awareness. Awareness that patterns can be interrupted even if they cannot be undone. Awareness that speaking fear does not create danger, it recognizes it. This story does not end with resolution because real lives rarely do. It ends with a question left deliberately open. What we inherit is not only love and talent but habits of silence and restraint. Whether those habits continue depends on whether someone chooses to notice them in time. Rob Reiner left a legacy that shaped generations. Rob Reiner was left to confront the part of that legacy that could not be celebrated, only understood. And understanding, while it cannot heal everything, may be the only place where repetition finally loses its grip.